So I want to talk about Ukraine, but I want to do something a little different with this segment. There's so much news, so many stories pouring out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that it seems almost wrong to cover them as news, since it would omit so much that's not covered. And actually, I think this issue is so important to many of us that I want to hear what you, the viewers, think about it. I want to know what you think of Russia's invasion and the events leading up to it over the past 10 years. I want to know what you think we should do or shouldn't do, what you think will happen or won't happen. So I'm going to lay out what I think about the conflict so far, and I will probably be wrong on multiple points, and perhaps this discussion will age terribly in 6 months' time. But I think we need to start a discussion here. Let's get into it. So if anything, I think there's an excess of Ukraine stories, a flood of shocking stories and really shocking footage, which undermines our ability to think rationally about the facts of the conflict. The fact is, there's a war on. Conventional wars kill lots of people, and at some point the war will end. I think the questions we should be asking are, how should the war end, and what can we do to ensure we get the good ending? What do you think?
All right, well, I'm just going to throw out another preface, which I always say with a lot of this stuff to do with Ukraine. I am no expert on these matters and do not have particularly strong opinions one way or the other, primarily because of the fact that my attitude towards the whole thing is that of the little Englander of I don't want this to get me kicked out of my house because I can no longer afford to pay the rent or my energy bills, and I don't want this to escalate to full all-out war where I'm going to get drafted to go elsewhere. So as far as I can tell, as the war's end, as far as I can see it, doesn't really matter that much to me. Obviously, barring the suffering that people on the ground in Ukraine are experiencing, which I obviously sympathise with, but I don't really know how it should end. I can't really give much of an informed opinion on that. As long as it... and I don't want to put forward a strong opinion because I might worry about risking making myself look a bit of a tit, to be perfectly honest, as some people have who have come out with very strong opinions on things that they're not very well informed on. But I just think to myself, I don't want to get dragged into this war. I want what's best for everybody. But the fact of the matter is, I don't really know what that is.
Yeah, and I respect that. And I think it's also worth realising that lots of, like us, you, me, and many people who are watching have had absolutely no agency when it comes to the history and destabilisation of Ukraine and so on. And so, because we have had no agency in it, we also have no responsibility morally, I think.
I don't have anything to do with Russia. The people that I do know that are from the Eastern European countries are all lovely people. Some of them are very pro-Putin. Some of them are less pro-Putin. So it's just very interesting. That's the closest connection that I have. And I've not really spoken to them since this whole thing. So I'd be very interested to find out what their feelings are on the situation right now.
So above all, I think to really address this matter, we need to think about the long term. All of the public conversation so far is fixated on the short term. This is a great way, in my opinion, to generate endless bloody crises with no hope of long-term peaceful solution. Before we can address the questions properly, we need to identify what the likely scenarios are for the end of the war. Plenty of people in the build-up to war in Ukraine thought that the Ukrainians would be steamrolled by Russia's military. I certainly thought that. But this campaign has revealed so many flaws in the Russian military that it deserves an essay all of its own. It's now abundantly clear that Russia will not bring this fight to a swift conclusion. It will take weeks or months for them to grind out a victory, and that's if the war goes their way. As far as I can see, there are several potential outcomes for the war. Either there is a negotiated peace, or a Russian victory, or a Ukrainian victory. Alternatively, the war may escalate and directly involve NATO and potentially the use of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. This last option is clearly the bad ending.
Yes, if there was definitely one ending I didn't want to have happen, it's that one.
Right.
I do not, more than anything, as well as being just like drawn into the conflict directly and having to go out on my boots and fight myself, I don't want nuclear war.
No.
I don't think anybody wants nuclear war.
Nuclear war is a bad idea.
But it is interesting what you're bringing up there with the fact that we all kind of expected that if something like this was going to happen, it would be done in like a weekend.
Yeah.
They would just steamroll the whole place. The whole place would be taken over, and it would almost be... I think we have strange expectations nowadays that a war like this would be clean. In a sense. Obviously, as clean as a war can be where you have to suffer casualties.
Well, I think that's partly because of the media coverage of Britain, the US, and NATO's wars, where our media has tried to portray them as clean.
Yes. But it's definitely not the sort of thing that's happened. And it's strange looking at, with Callum, some of the images that have been coming from Ukraine. Obviously, there's so much misinformation going around that I covered last week, talking about a lot of the propaganda stories, the fog of war coming from there, where you can never tell what's truly being accurately reported or not, and what's just being put out for the morale of the people on the ground and just being misinterpreted by Western media. But there are those photos of like the small little Scooby-Doo van full of Russian soldiers driving in that makes you think, these guys aren't as well as equipped as I was expecting.
As we were led to believe.
Yeah, and there are also reports of just tanks breaking down at the side of the road. A lot of really old equipment that people were expecting that by now Russia would have so much more advanced equipment to do this whole thing with, and it doesn't seem that they do.
Yeah, but part of the reason for that is, of course, NATO aid. And although it's the fashion of the day to criticise NATO for an anemic response, we should be in no doubt that NATO's aid to the Ukraine has been lethally effective. Without the huge arsenal of anti-tank and anti-air weaponry donated by the Western world, to say nothing of military advisement missions like the UK's Operation Orbital, which trained 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers in the Western way of war, and the wealth of military intelligence from satellites and intel specialists being poured into the Ukrainian high command, the list goes on. Without all of this, it is quite likely that Ukraine would have fallen within the first week. Russia's aircraft would have operated with impunity over Ukrainian airspace. Its armoured vehicles would have made successful incursions across the Ukrainian countryside, cutting off major cities, and the Kadyrovtsi brigade sent to take out Zelensky may even have succeeded. So this should be cause for celebration, right? We got involved, we supported our ally, and rather than them being abandoned to a hostile power, they've conducted a spirited and effective defence. But if you've been following the footage closely, you will notice that an awful lot of Russian conscripts have been blown to pieces by the weapons and expertise we've given the Ukrainians. That's what they're there for. You know, it's not just pictures of smoking vehicles. Like hundreds and hundreds of Russians have been killed by these weapons that we're giving. And I have to ask myself sometimes, if the end result of this conflict is that Russia does take Ukraine, what have we achieved other than acting as merchants of death and destruction and multiplying the death toll on both sides by a factor of 10?
I can't really say much to disagree with the points that you've put forward there. Once again, I'm not particularly well informed on it.
I know it's a tricky one, and I'm sure people will be getting mad in the chat and saying, "Look, Ukraine has a right to defend itself. It's a sovereign nation. The people want self-determination." All of this, and yes, I fully sympathise with all of those points. But I'm looking at this from a Western perspective, and I'm thinking, are we, like we all think we're doing the right thing?
Are we simply extending this?
Yeah.
Artificially past
if we
the
look at
natural
this,
point it would come to.
Slightly more long-term, not just the day-to-day of, oh, look, a Russian tank was blown up with a British anti-tank weapon. Isn't that great, plucky little Ukraine? If we look a bit more long-term than that, are we just causing an enormous disaster and getting thousands of people killed?
Well, you could also make the argument that in choosing to push these people forwards and into this invasion in the first place, that ultimately all of the responsibility lies at Russia's door for taking the invasion in the first place. And there is also reports, I don't know how accurate these are, that many of the people who were positioned on the border of Ukraine were not expecting these instructions to come in that, okay, you need to go across the border, we're taking it, lads.
Certainly. And the Russian military, I think, well, obviously the Russian High Command, but also the Russian military at all levels bears a huge amount of responsibility for their criminally incompetent display.
I mean, they are the ones who seemingly are sending these people in with massively under-equipped.
Right. But we also have to remember that it's not just a greater Russian body count that's supplying all of these weapons gives. If the end result is to be a Russian victory, then what we are doing is ensuring a very large Ukrainian body count, since they prolong the conflict, the shelling, the bombardments, and so on and so forth, the refugee crisis.
Of the footage that I have seen, it's not been very pleasant to see
No.
Otherwise very nice European cities in Ukraine being shelled and seeing people, the fear that people are going through as they're just, out on their balcony or something, and then all of the windows behind them get absolutely just demolished and blown out from a shell hitting the building.
Right. So clearly, this applies a moral argument whereby if we've added all of this weaponry, then we now need to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose, because otherwise we would have just made the whole situation worse.
Would that not be the sunk cost fallacy in action,
Yes,
though?
it would be.
Yeah.
So you see, there are no easy answers, but I'm just trying to lay out the unpopular positions here because I think they really need to be considered.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. Whilst to use the word again, the fog of war is engulfing everything and everybody related to it. It's very difficult to be able to pick out the morality of any individual action, because it's going to have so many knock-on effects down the line that will inevitably, because at the end of the day there are people on the ground fighting on both sides, it will inevitably lead to death.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is horrible.
I think it's also worth saying the invasion of Ukraine has come as such a shock to the West that many have immediately just declared Putin a madman. It's tempting, but Putin is not mad. He may not have the veneer of statesman-like cunning that he maintained until this particular operation devolved into a fiasco, but he is still viewing geopolitics through a rational realpolitik perspective. The idea that he is a lunatic beyond the reach of reason is misinformed. And that's not to say Putin's a great guy or anything like that. No. It's to say that there is a rational calculus by which Putin operates. He just has a very different perspective on the world to our leaders.
I'll agree with that entirely. I mean, probably one of the better commenters I've seen talking about this, at least in terms of putting forward the part of the Russian side of it, has been Konstantin Kisin from Trigonometry, who I think he's Russian. He's either Russian or Ukrainian.
Right.
Whichever one. So he has a bit more of a perspective on the attitudes and mentalities of the people talking about over there. And once again, people are saying, "Oh, Putin's a madman." Most of the people in Russia don't support Ukraine. I have to massively disagree with that, given, once again, the people that I do know who are from that area have been very, very pro-Putin in the background. Obviously, not going to say without...
Yeah, I mean, I've known a fair amount of Russian people, and there is a split. There are some people who are definitely pro, and there are some people who are definitely very anti. And it's curious how that manifests in diaspora communities as well.
But Konstantin has basically just been saying on a few Twitter threads that... underestimating Putin as a madman is not the way to go. Yeah. And in fact, it's putting a very Western perspective on things, because we're looking at things through a very Western perspective on what war is, on what land is, on what historical conflicts are, where we're trying to put things aside.
What nations are as well.
Yes, whereas Putin is looking at things in a very Russian sense, which, not being a Russian, I can't really speak to. But
let's try and explore that perspective a bit more. So I think in a real sense, you could say that Vladimir Putin has no option but to take Ukraine at this point. With the amount of resource and influence that Russia has already lost in this invasion, he needs concrete gains. Otherwise, his regime will probably be eaten alive by the Russian nationalists that constitute his primary power base. If NATO arms shipments and sanctions make the difference between him winning or losing the war, I think it's likely that he will escalate. And a country with 40,000 tons of chemical weapons and 6,400 nuclear missiles should be dealt with very carefully, and not through virtue signalling on Twitter.
No, just claiming that he's a madman means that you're underestimating him. It's
and
not
as a
good
result,
thing to do.
I don't think that Putin can accept a status quo ante bellum, which means everyone goes back to the pre-war borders and then pretends like nothing happened. I don't think he can do that.
When you've on a conflict of this scale brought into European shores for the first time in who knows how long, that's absolutely not going to happen.
No. So what concessions does he want then? And we should be aware of this, by the way. He has reiterated 3 demands several times, and he will probably compromise on them if the war continues to go badly. So those demands are the recognition of the Crimea and the independent separatist republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and the assured neutrality of Ukraine. So recognition, demilitarization, and neutrality. These are likely the minimum gains that Russia will accept for a peace without escalation, unless there is a black swan event, I expect.
Potentially.
So then look at how Ukraine would respond to that. Well, Ukraine is unlikely to accept demilitarization, I'll just say.
Yeah, probably not.
Right, they can't exactly trust Russia at this point. So they won't accept that unless their armed forces are decisively destroyed in this conflict, which would mean tens or hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed. And that's what I was alluding to when I was referring to the NATO aid. Ukraine does have a large minority of genuine ultranationalists, SS badge-toting neo-Nazis. something which is almost taboo to mention these days, although the BBC were more than happy to discuss it as recently as 2018, 2019. This minority is unlikely to accept territorial concessions to Russia unless they have no choice. They're not going to accept recognition of the Crimea or Donetsk or Luhansk. Neutrality is a whole other question. Even if an agreement was signed on paper, the West will undoubtedly find many ways to undermine the neutrality of Ukraine through economic aid and so forth. This is something that America has been a master at for many years. So are we simply hoping that a combination of devastating economic sanctions and lethal military aid will bring down Putin's regime before he can reach for the nuclear button? That may be what happens, but it could turn out to be a catastrophically dangerous fantasy. Yeah.
Sorry, there's not that much I can add to some of this.
No, that's quite all right. So as it is, I think that the main motive behind Western aid on our side is to make politicians and followers of the mainstream media feel good about themselves. I really think that's what it's come to. The average British citizen isn't seeing the dismembered corpses of Russian and Ukrainian conscripts littering the outskirts of Kiev. They just see a few knocked out armoured vehicles and think, hooray for the Endlong.
I suppose a lot of people aren't, but there is still access, much more easy than it would have been back in the day, to these sorts of footage that, for instance, that you've seen over the weekend, where you see the actual physical toll that this has taken on people who have been, dismembered and blown apart by shells and other such things. It's not pleasant to look at. So I think if people are going out to find the reality of the situation on the ground, they're going to find something much more grisly than they're being shown in the mainstream.
Yes,
but obviously the mainstream does have an outsized reach.
Yes, and you have to look quite hard, I think, to really get a picture of it as well.
It's also difficult with some of the stuff to tell whether it's
real or fake.
Real or fake.
Yeah. Finally, I want to talk a bit about the home front as far as it relates to this. So on the home front, there are concerning developments. While nobody is arguing that the Russian oligarchs deserve the egregious wealth they have gathered through generally exploitation and cronyism through the collapse of the Soviet Empire, few people seem to realize that Ukraine has even bigger problems with oligarchs than Russia. Judging by the Pandora Papers, Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the developed world when it comes to oligarchs. President Zelensky's long media and political career appears to have been bankrolled by the Ukrainian Cypriot Israeli oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky, who is 1/3 of the triumvirate that owns Privat Group, the largest and most influential monopoly in Ukraine, with thousands of holdings across the world. So these oligarchs are not being punished for corruption or ill dealing, but for dissidence. Their relationship with the Russian regime is what marks them out for punishment, since the Western establishment stands against the Russians. This has allowed the UK to seize nearly $300 million in assets, I think, at the last count. Sadiq Khan advocated for confiscating their London properties to the tune of nearly £400 million. The fact that foreign investors have been able to speculate on the British housing market, by the way, driving up prices to ludicrous levels, is a discussion in and of itself. But it's not just Russians. Ukrainians, Chinese, Arabian billionaires, many foreign investors are deeply involved in the London property scene. Nothing has been done about these, of course, until they, too, become political dissidents. With these seizures, I fear we are moving towards a world where property rights are only absolute for those who toe the party line.
Yeah, I feel that a lot of the seizures and talk of that sort of thing is a bit severe, a bit quick to... I don't know. It's a little bit of a tough move to make, and I don't think we should be doing that sort of thing.
It feels very gangsterish.
Yeah, I've seen some people talk about potentially, I forget which one it was like a Tory or Labour MP talking about how we need to just throw out any Russian-born people. I think it was in a comment on one of the previous podcasts, actually. They were talking about how we need to just deport all of the any Russian citizens who are currently living in the UK. And I really dislike that kind of brand of collective guilt.
I found it amazing how within 5 days, everyone had gone from not caring about Russians at all to a full-on state of Russophobia in this country. Yeah,
I think it's negative. It's a very, very bad thing to negatively demonise every individual on the basis of whatever collective group that they may be part of.
The speed with which that happened, I found, even having followed propaganda and mass psychosis and so on, I found that quite frightening, quite disturbing.
Not particularly surprising given the climate that we currently live in, though, sadly, socially speaking.
Yeah. So what will happen in Ukraine? What should happen and what should we do about it? Let us know what you think in the comments.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as Carl's interview with Jason Miller, the CEO of Getter, on the future of social media. And if you want to follow Jason, you can also follow him, of course, at Getter, and you can go and check out him at Jason Miller in DC, with our special trip that we took him around the magic roundabout of Swindon, which he very much enjoyed, I'm here. Anyway, thank you and goodbye.